How many outdoorsy people in the house today? Those outdoorsy people where Bass Pro Shop is like your Disneyland. That's the place you love to go. It's your Toys R Us. Unfortunately, my wife and I are not those outdoorsy types. Our idea of camping is more glamping. Any glampers here? Where the idea of getting dirty is not the most exciting thing. We want to be surrounded by the dirt, not in the dirt. But my dad loved the idea of his sons one day hiking Half Dome with him. And we would go to Yosemite when we were young and would always stare at that epic rock face. It's like the attainable Everest that people say they can actually climb. It's just an iconic image that a lot of us know. So when we were older, he wanted to take us on a trip to Half Dome. So my wife and I were newly married. We were pregnant with our firstborn, and my dad had set up this trip to Half Dome. So as we're venturing, getting ready for this trip, we're excited. It was going to be a one-day trip. My wife's going to be going into labor soon, so it had to be a quick overnight trip. So my dad's friend's an experienced hiker, and as my dad was talking about our trip to Half Dome with him, he said, "Oh, don't go the traditional way up Half Dome." Now, the normal way up Half Dome is a lot of switchbacks. It's about an 8-mile hike. He said there's a much easier path called the Sunrise Trail, and it's much more scenic and beautiful. You'll really enjoy this way. It's a much easier hike to take. So my dad had this group formed together, and a few of us were going out along with a guy named Ken Muzio from our church and a friend from his work and his 2 sons in their 20s. So we set out to go to Half Dome. So here's a picture of us and Half Dome. You got to love that gorgeous long hair my brother and I have. We were in a Nazarite vow at the time. Don't get jealous of those beautiful locks. But there's Half Dome in the background. We don't really cause too many people to stumble, so we can take that awful shot off of the camera there. So we were set out to go to Half Dome. So we wake up bright and early, about a 4 a.m. trip, and we're going to return that evening. So it's just literally a one-night trip, and we're headed out to Half Dome. So we start hiking before the sun rises, and as we're on this trail, we've hiked for about 3 miles, and we're waiting for the sign that says the trail has begun. And as we're hiking and waiting and hiking and waiting, we finally come across this sign that says, "Welcome to the Sunrise Trail, 10 miles to Half Dome." We'd already been hiking 3, and we quickly do the math. The normal Half Dome hike is 8 miles up and then 8 miles back. We're now set out for a 26-mile round-trip hike in one day. We are a little overwhelmed by that hike that we're about to venture on. So as we're hiking, my dad's friend was with him and his 2 sons in their 20s. They were just the types that you don't want to spend a day with. How many have been around those obnoxious people before, where they just would run up the trail and kick up dust on the track and just pack Twinkies and donuts to eat during this hike, and they were just the kind of guys you don't want to hike with. Well, as we're hiking, one of the members of our team injures their leg. And all of a sudden, this slows our hike down significantly, and we are losing daylight hours. We have no cell phone reception. My wife thinks that I'm going to be back later that evening. That is now a long-distant prayer that we'll be back that evening at a reasonable hour. We finally make it to the base of Half Dome. The sun is setting. We have to make it to the top of Half Dome so I can get cell phone reception to call my wife and let her know that we're going to be back later that evening, as she is in labor soon. So we climb the top of Half Dome. It's beautiful. We get some photos. I call my wife and say, "Hey, we're behind in our hike, but we'll be back tonight. Don't worry." We hike down Half Dome and we set back on the Sunrise Trail, 13 miles. Well, as we are starting to hike back, the temperature quickly drops. And it starts to get really cold. And we all realize we had planned for a day hike, so we all have sweaty shorts and T-shirts that we're wearing with no nighttime gear. And now it's freezing cold. But then it also dawns on us, we didn't pack enough water, and the water filtration device we had wasn't working. So now we're low on water and low on supplies. As we continue to hike, it's now pitch black outside. We realize we didn't pack any flashlights. So we're on this hike, and we are really in a tough spot. The Sunrise Trail is no longer sunrise and sunny. This easy path has become quite hellish for many of us. And as we're walking, my dad realizes, wait, in my bag at the bottom, I have this small headlamp I threw in just in case. So he has a small little promotional light on his head that is guiding the way. Ken Muzio had this little GPS that couldn't connect to the satellite, but this micro light is leading us along this path now deep into the darkness of nighttime as trees are covering us from the moonlight and we're walking. And Ken would run up ahead on the trail and he would find the path. And little did I know, he was actually running up ahead on the trail to kick out the fresh bear excrement that was there as there was bears surrounding us as we were walking down this trail. Now, that obnoxious crew that was with us, they actually stayed back longer to take pictures. Unfortunately, they didn't have a light, and as they were walking out, took a wrong path and were lost in this trail. We eventually get back to our car at 3 a.m. in the morning, exhausted. I mean, really freezing cold as the temperatures dropped incredibly fast. And I'm calling, trying to get a hold of my wife to let her know we're alive and not to call the Rangers. So as we're driving, I finally get reception, and I connect with my wife and say, Rachel, and then it hangs up. And I have no reception now till 7 a.m. as my wife thinks that was her last words of her husband in this car ride home. We eventually get home. I had a very intense talk from my wife as she was about to go into labor on that I would never do that again in my life. We later got word that this group that was with us, they were found by a ranger. One of them almost died of hypothermic shock because we weren't prepared for the journey that we were on. And really the difference between life and death was that little light found in our backpack. We are in a time and place in our culture where we are surrounded in darkness, and light is of desperate need right now. And the light that Jesus has promised is the light that he has placed in his church. And in John chapter 8, when he declares that he is the light of the world, he literally echoes that story we read about in creation, where God says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He speaks the worlds into existence. And then out of that, he says, let there be light. As the sun was the governing light to the earth, Jesus declares that he is now the governing light to his people. And he's called to bring light to those that are captured in darkness. Now, in the first century, that concept of light is very different than our concept of light. Thomas Edison was not one of the first 12 disciples. Hello. There was no electricity. There was no light bulbs. The only sources of light they had were the sun and fire. So Jesus declares that he's the light of the world, echoing that imagery of the sun that lights up the earth. But he then, to our disbelief, says that we are now the light of the world. And in Matthew chapter 5, it gives this image that his people, those that believe in him, are now these little lights. That we are those that are called to light fires around us that guides those that are trapped in darkness. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 says, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all of the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. He says, my church, my people are called to be light. They're this city set up on a hill. In essence, they are lighthouses to ships that are lost at sea. The light that is in you is a desperate need in our culture right now. You are strategically placed in your environment, your household, your community, your workplace to be the light that only Jesus can provide. And we often have sung this song, we are the light of the world, those different types of things, and it's been relegated to these preschool type nursery rhymes, but it's much more than that. We're called to have the fire of Jesus burning within us that can be contagious. And what we tend to miss is that line at the very end. The way that our light shines is not through just singing some songs, but through the good works that Jesus has asked us to do. It's through our activity and action, not just what we believe or do on a Sunday morning, that our light begins to shine. One of our calls here at the church is to be as a church to disciple leaders that will transform culture. That's the vision here at The Rock. And one of the terms we tend to wrestle with is, what is a disciple? Is a disciple someone that goes to a class after they get saved? And we said that a disciple is more than that. A disciple is someone that is actively growing in the words, the ways, and the works of Jesus. Well, we want to see all those combined. For some of us are really good at studying our word. Some of us are really good at doing community. Some of us are really good at doing outreach and evangelism. But a disciple is active in all three. And we see that Jesus is passionate about the works of his Father. In John chapter 4, we have this interaction with him and this woman at the well. And as he begins to reveal hidden things in her life, she goes off to tell everyone, and his disciples come back and say, Jesus, do you want any food? And I love that moment when they ask him that. Jesus says so sternly, I have a food you know not of. How many hangry people here? Those that get angry when they're hungry, right? And Jesus, in this hangry type moment, says, I have a food you know not of. And the disciples are really caught off guard. They say, what is Jesus talking about? I mean, there's no 7-Eleven nearby. He didn't stop by a fast food place. He says, no, my food is to do the will of him who has sent me and to complete his works. Now, when we think of doing works for Jesus, they tend to be something we add on to our life. They tend to be an addendum, a have to. But what we learn in the life of Jesus is the works that the Father gave him, what Jesus models, is actually not a burden, it's a blessing. That when we begin to do the works of Jesus, I believe it produces an awakening within us. And the church right now, if Jesus says that that's his food, we are greatly emaciated in the things of the Spirit. There are works that Jesus has called us to do that aren't a burden, but become a blessing in your life. And as we learn to engage with where Jesus is working, an awakening will actually take place. Amen, church? Can we believe in that? That as we partner with the works of Jesus, we actually see breakthrough and blessing in our life, not just more things on our to-do list. Now, when you say the word work, we all have different mental pictures that come. When you say the word work to some, we think of busyness. This is a common image for the word work. We have this person here with all these things in their hands and they're running frantically. How many recovering workaholics in the house? Right, those that are just running from thing to thing. And for others, the word work looks more like this picture here. In just 1 hour from now, I'll only have 4 hours left until I have to work a mere 3 hours. Where work is just a space you occupy as you muse about the day's findings and search Facebook and Twitter and Instagram just to pass the hours by. Our definition of work is not called to be cultural, but biblical. The Bible needs to be our guiding factor, not what culture would say or what you've been modeled. And for us to understand how to live out the works of Jesus, we have to understand what work is biblically. So here's our hope for this morning. We're going to do a quick study on the word work in the Old Testament and how it really impacts our lives and how Jesus is inviting us to be actively a part of his work in our lives. Secondly, we're going to have my friend Brandon Leone just tell his testimony on how he really started to engage in inviting Jesus into his work life, into his business, and the impact that's had. So let's get ready. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. Let's look at this together. It says this. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had accomplished. We are familiar with the creation narrative where God speaks the world into existence, and we have this strange passage right here in Genesis 2, that God, who needs no rest, takes a break. And the reason God is showing this example of rest is so he puts it in created order so that we as his creation follow his example. That we're called to rest. And it says he rests from his work. And the word work there means craftsmanship. Where God has created this masterpiece called the universe, and within it, he's created these image bearers called humankind. And he places them there, and he takes time to reflect and really sets an example for all of us. Many of us have 7 days in our week, all of us do, 168 hours in our week, all of us do, but do we set a time aside, not just to rest, but to reflect on the work that God is doing in our life? See, God sets an example for us to look back and see what he's actually doing. And Adam is set this example of what work should look like, that it has a rhythm, that it has a balance to it. And then in Genesis 2:15, we see that Adam is put in the garden to work. As God had been to work, now Adam is called to tend the garden and keep it. Genesis 2:15, the Lord God said, and he took man and put him in the garden of Eden to till and to keep it. We often think that work is a part of the curse, but it's actually part of God's blessing. Work happens before the fall, not after it. Many of us think of heaven as this escapist place that we'll go one day and all of our dreams will come true. We'll sit in clouds and eat lots of awesome heavenly chocolate. That's not the idea of heaven. We'll actually work in the context of the future, where we're going to be given stewardships and responsibilities under the leadership of King Jesus. As heaven inhabits earth, we'll have responsibilities within it. Work is not a part of the curse. But after man falls, what we see happen is that work becomes difficult. The ground is cursed because of what takes place. Genesis 3:17, it says this, "And cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat all the days of your life." And what we now see is the struggle between humankind and creation, where as they begin to till the soil, it's difficult. There are dying crops. There's no longer this breakthrough all the time. There's no longer this Garden of Eden that God is tending and keeping alongside Adam. Adam has now a difficult road ahead. And we see this struggle throughout the Old Testament story. But what God does is he doesn't leave his creation alone to fend for themselves. God reaches in and helps those that call out to him. And we see the journey of Abraham take place, where God brings blessing to the work of his hand. We see the journey of Isaac, where God brings blessing to the work of his hand. The journey of Jacob, where God brings blessing to the work of his hand. God has called those people that call out to him to be a blessing and to bring blessing to those around us. That's our responsibility in work. And what we see is in the story of Jacob, his name becomes Israel. His sons have this fight, and they sell one of the sons named Joseph into slavery. That's called dysfunctional family. So we see Joseph sold into slavery, and what's so interesting is it says that Joseph prospered in the midst of his slavery. He actually brought blessing and abundance to the household of a wicked slave owner named Potiphar. See, we as the believers of Jesus, we as the church are called to bring abundance and blessing. A lot of us live in this perspective that we're just called to get by, struggle, and survive. The very nature of God's grace upon us is to bring back that garden wherever we walk. That the Garden of Eden is what we carry alongside of us as those that are now new creations in Jesus. So Joseph's held in captivity, and as he's there, he brings blessing to Potiphar. He's then given upgrades, and he's now helping out Pharaoh. And there's this famine that's about to take place. And Joseph has a strategy to help bring provision to an entire nation that doesn't serve God. Mind-blowing. And as he's there, he becomes a witness, a representative of this God of the people of Israel named Yahweh. And as he's there, he invites his family back. There's this restoration that takes place before this famine is underway. And the people of Israel begin to multiply in Egypt. But right at the end of that story, we have this verse that says, Pharaoh forgot what Joseph had done for his house. And now the people of Israel are held in captivity. And as they're held in captivity, we see that struggle of work come back. And now their captor is forcing them to work heavy labor, and they're treated as slaves. And as they're in this slave state, what does God do? He begins to hear their cries. Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering. For some of us here today, God sees you in the midst of your suffering and your struggle. He sees us right where we are, and he hears our cry. And for some of us, we need to start crying out to him that he would bring breakthrough in the midst of our struggle. So these people are brought to a place where they've lost faith in their God. They've turned away from him. They begin to cry out to him again. And as they cry out to him, he begins to send a deliverer named Moses. We know this story. And as Moses is start to be raised up, he says, I see their suffering. I'm called to release them from their captivity. Verse 20, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. And after that, he, meaning Pharaoh, will let my people go. Now, the person that he chooses to bring deliverance to those in captivity is the person least qualified, a guy named Moses. So Moses is rescued, has this amazing beginning where he is now in Pharaoh's house, but he murders a man and goes in hiding. He's now been hiding in the desert for 40 years doing shepherd's work, and as he's there, this bush that's on fire calls him out. Now Moses can't speak very well. He's timid. He views his life as a failure, and God says, that's the qualifications I'm looking for to lead a great deliverance. How many of us have ever felt disqualified before? See, God is calling us to partner alongside of him in his works. But here's the catch. The moment we feel qualified is often when he skips over our resume and looks to those that aren't feeling qualified. Because God's power is perfected in our weakness. And we talk about the miracles of Jesus that we're all called to perform. We talk about the blessing that Jesus brought in setting captives free. A lot of us feel inadequate to do those things. We hear stories about healing and we think, that's never me. One of my favorite stories was last week. I won't use his name, but his name is Brent Gove. He's right over there to the left. Brent's like, I had a story like you. I'm like, what's that story? He's like, I'm driving in the rain and there's this person on the side of the road. And God says, give them a ride. And he's like, I don't have time to give them a ride. And God says, give them your umbrella. And he's like, it's my brand new umbrella. And he flips a U-turn and goes back, picks the man up. And the guy says, absolutely, I'll hop in your car. And it's one of those moments when you think to yourself, this is not smart to do. It's dangerous to pick up hitchhikers. Brent's having this moment. But throughout that time, as they're talking in the car, I believe Brent starts to share about the Lord and offers to pray about him. And all of a sudden, Brent becomes the crazy guy in the car. And the person is looking at him like, can I get out of here as fast as I can? I love that story. God uses simple obedience to bring breakthrough. It's the simple things that actually bring freedom to those that are held captive as we are witnesses, as we are light in all the world. And as God calls Moses, who is greatly disqualified, he calls him to be a deliverer of his people. We are called to walk in the power to break others out of captivity. How many have friends and family that need freedom in their life? How many know friends that have been bound by addiction that need freedom? The person that's called to bring them deliverance is you, because Jesus is in you. And one of the things he's equipped us all with is our story. It's our testimony. Your testimony has power. It has so much power in Revelation. John writes that our testimonies are what overcome the enemy through the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. Your story has power. In those moments when you pray for someone and get nervous and scared, know that your story has power. The moment someone shares with you a struggle that they have, ask yourself, have I had that struggle before, and has God brought me through it? That's the moment to share your story. A few years ago, we were having this amazing outpouring of God's Spirit at our youth ministry, and one night, went up to preach, had my message planned, and God had other plans. And worship went on and on and on and continued to go. And that night, a group home had come to visit our youth ministry. And students are getting healed, and they're crying, and they're laughing. It's one of those wild nights. Well, a few students in that group home start to weep under the power of the Lord. And the other members of the group home have no idea what's happening. They're thinking, did someone say something to that person and hurt their feelings? And so the group home leaders come to me and say, can you explain what God's doing here? So I said, okay, let's let the service wind down and we'll go have a meeting in the back. So we start walking out of the auditorium into the lobby area, and one of the girls stayed behind with one of the counselors. I said, do you want to join us for the meeting? She said, no. And I knew something was not right. So I go into the back room, and we're there, we're just explaining what God did, and people are then offering or asking for prayer. It's just a powerful time with the students. Well, a leader runs out to me and says, we need your help in the lobby right now. So I run out to the lobby, and there's this girl that didn't want to come into the back room with us. She's now in the corner yelling and screaming. She's fully demonized. And as she's there, we know she needs freedom. Inside the lobby, there's about 40 students. It's late at night. A lot of them came from other churches that have never seen anything like that before. So I asked, I said, okay, let's get the counselor here. Let's see if we can take her to a back room and do this in private. I said, why don't you join us? And she says, no. And she flips on her back and begins squirming like a snake through the audience. It gets really real, really quick. So as she does this, she literally slithers into the auditorium. And we know Jesus wants to set this girl free. So we're there. I guess some of the leaders were praying. We've seen things like this before. We've been overseas and helped lead people through freedom like that. And as we're praying, we can sense that the spirit that has a hold of her is not very strong. But there's not freedom. We spend about an hour there, and there's really no breakthrough. One of our students comes up and says, I want to pray. I said, no, this isn't the right time for you to be praying for this girl. And as we're there and praying for her, we notice that she has cuts all up and down her arm and in her scalp, a lot of self-harm. She says, no, I want to pray for her, and I want to tell her my testimony. I said, hey, sweetheart, bless your heart, but she's not really a captive audience to hear you speak with her right now. She says, no, I want to share it. And at this point, we really have no other options. I said, all right. So this girl sits down and says, I want to tell you my story. Out of nowhere, the girl perks up and listens. And as she's there listening, she begins to weep as this other girl begins to tell about how God set her free from death and suicide and self-harm. The other girl that was under the influence and oppression of the enemy begins to weep and gives her life to Jesus and is completely set free. Come on, let's give it up for Jesus for that. Come on. And it was in that moment, it wasn't the powerful prayers, it wasn't the authority, it wasn't the oil that we were trying to anoint her with. It was the power of the story, the testimony that brought freedom. All of us have a testimony and story. And for us to partner with the works of Jesus, we have to allow him to begin to work in our lives. But in order for that to take place, there are some changes that need to happen. And as I was studying this story, I came across this verse and was shocked by it. I had to believe I hadn't seen it before. But Exodus chapter 5, verse 9 says this, is Moses is sent out to deliver these people. He goes up to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's response is this. He says, let heavier work be laid on them then, and they will labor at it and pay no attention to deceptive words. So the response of Pharaoh to Moses' declaration to let God's people go is to give them more work. He believes that through busyness, they won't hear the promises that Yahweh is trying to reveal to them. That through busyness, they're actually going to miss what God is going to do. I believe we don't see the power the Holy Spirit has called our churches to function in because of the busyness that we're burdened by. We have so much activity in our life. When we talk about doing the works of Jesus, it sounds overwhelming. But the works of Jesus aren't called to be overwhelming. We just need to make some life adjustment to hear what the Holy Spirit is saying. That if we keep rushing back and forth to places, we'll miss the activity that Jesus wants to do in us and through us. That's what he's called us to. Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, had this amazing story in it. It's a small little story about these two Princeton professors that were doing this study called the Good Samaritan test. And in this, they took some theology students that were in seminary, and they had two different groups. They bring the first group in and the second group in. They say, okay, here's what we want you to do. You're going to give a spontaneous sermon on the Good Samaritan. And we're going to study the passage right now, and then you're going to walk across the campus to this other lecture hall and teach the Good Samaritan story. So as they're there, in the first group, the professor was supposed to act very aloof. And as they're talking about the Good Samaritan, he's supposed to look at his watch and say, oh my goodness, you're running late. You have to run over there right now and get to your lecture. The other group comes in, and they do the same thing. They talk about the Good Samaritan, and the professor would look at his watch and say, wow, we finished our discussion. You're actually early, so take your time in walking over to the lecture hall. Little did these students know, it wasn't about them giving a spontaneous sermon. It was about what they would walk across to that place they're about to teach. So what they had set up was a person in their pathway lying on the ground moaning in pain. And to the first group that was late to their lecture, they would literally run over that person and step over the person in pain as they're about to go teach on the Good Samaritan. The very story about someone that would drop everything to help someone in need is what they're about to teach on as they are leaping over this person writhing in pain. And the people that were told that they were late to their lecture, only 10% of those students stopped to help the man. This burden of busyness has plagued God's people and his church, where we're so filled with things to do, we miss what God wants to do. What would it look like for a church that laid down the burden of busyness and just said, Holy Spirit, what do you have for me today? What would it look like to invite the works of Jesus into our lives? And as Moses leads this amazing deliverance of the people of Israel, Exodus 14:31 says this, Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. That word work there literally means God stretched out his hand. And what we see in the life and ministry of Jesus is that same picture, as God stretched out his hand to deliver Egypt, Jesus stretched out his hand and now stretches out his hands through us to see people set free. But we have to make room for him to work. We have to make room and say, Holy Spirit, we invite you into our lives. We invite you into our day. We invite you into, not my schedule, your schedule. And see what Jesus wants to do. For us to be the disciples God has called us to be, it's more than just attending church on a Sunday. It's bringing church Monday through Saturday to those that need it. What would it look like to partner with Jesus' works? And as I was praying about this, I ran into a friend, and he shared some stories that were just stirring for me that I believe will be a huge encouragement to us. So would you welcome my friend, Brandon Leone, as he shares right now. Let's give it up for Brandon.
Man, I'm so excited to share today. I'm so excited to be here with my family. Let me just start out by saying that you guys have the power of Jesus inside of you. If you've accepted him as your Lord, you have that same power. I was brushing my teeth this morning, and I just got that song, like the same power that conquered the grave lives in me. And I wish that I had Preston's voice, but I do not. So I start singing it, and my two boys are right there with me. One of them is 14 months old. The other one's 3 years old. And I start singing, and my 14-month-old just looks at me and starts like walking. He just learned how to walk, by the way. So he's like running away from me. And then my other 3-year-old comes up to me, and he just, Daddy, stop that. I'm like, oh, but I love the song though. So it's just funny how I don't know. I love my kids, but you know what? How many of you parents, are there any parents out here? I mean, there's probably a lot of parents here, right? You will not withhold anything from your children. Any children in here? Everyone has parents, right? Right? I don't know. Pretty simple. But your parents will withhold nothing from you, and that's what Jesus wants for you. He wants you to be the best version of yourself, which is just glorifying him in every single thing you do. And so I just want to kind of share my story. I have been here for about 4 years at the church. When I came to the church, I was struggling. Like I was beat up. I was tired. We had just kind of cycled out of 4 years of youth ministry. My wife and I, we purchased our first house, which is a fixer-upper. and we took the kitchen down to the studs, and we were remodeling it. And did I mention we had a brand new 1-month-old baby boy? And then I'm working 2 jobs. I'm working real estate, and there's just so many things going on in my life. I was busy. And I'm like, God, like, why? I would ask, I'm like, why am I where I am? Like, where am I in my life? I don't feel like I'm glorifying you, but I just came from serving you, like, and I'm burnt out. And I would serve, and I would serve, and I would serve. And what happened was, I came to this church, got involved in a community group, and connected with Brian Emmons over there. He was a connections pastor before Mark, and then I got connected in another community group, and then I started playing on the Rock softball team, and then I made some friendships, some relationships, and then I got invited into a discipleship group, and through that, I started to look at Jesus' life, and I said, you know what? I'm not perfect. I don't need to be perfect, but my identity was in works, was in working, and then what would happen is I wasn't doing what I thought Jesus wanted me to do to the full capacity. So then I was unworthy, and I would have guilt and shame, and, oh man, I need to do more for you, God. And then if I do more, Jesus will love me more. And how many of you guys know that is not true? That is not true at all. And so as I start to look at the Father and I just spend time with Jesus, it was just an amazing time, because then I learned that I just focus on him and his word and what he thinks about me. And my identity is through him and not through my works, and not through success, and not through approval, and not through money. And that's just one of those crazy lessons you learn, where the switch goes on in your mind. And what was so amazing is that as we're going through this discipleship program, Brian shared something with me, and we talked about when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and he goes and he's baptized, and he comes out, and heaven opens up, and God says, "This is my son who I am well pleased." And so, I just want to share with you today, that's how Jesus feels that way about you. He's so pleased with you. And so I realized, wow, he loves me no matter what. Whether I do something or don't do anything, he loves me and he's pleased with me. I don't have to perform for anyone. I don't have to do anything other than be loved by my Father. So I started spending time with them, and my wife and I are struggling at the time. We were heavily in debt, and real estate was not working the way that I wanted it to, but I knew how to be busy. But how many of you know that you can be as busy as you want, but that doesn't mean that you're more successful? You can make yourself busy, right? And that's what we do. And so I started just having conversations with God, what do you want me to do? And he says, I want you to bring me with you to work. How many of you have ever been called out like that? But it's not really the place, right? It's okay, I'll go to work and then I'll come home, or I'll go to church, right? Or I can only pray with someone when I'm in church, right? And that's not what he's called us to do. And so he started to say, bring me with you to work. And I'm like, okay. So, I start going and praying in the morning, before work. And I had an agent cuss me out for something I didn't do. And I just got off the phone and prayed with them and loved on them. And before you know it, I start to be able to pray with people in my real estate office. And then as I start to focus more on the Father, right? And not myself and my own life. Last year I was able to help more families than I've ever helped. And this year I doubled that, which I didn't even think was possible. And so it's going over to every single area of my life, because I'm just giving my life to him. And the funny thing is I get led to a place like Home Goods, and I'm driving, I leave an appointment, I'm driving down the street, and I'm like, I got to go to Home Goods. I never go to Home Goods. That's where chicks go to shop. Guys don't go to Home Goods, right? But honestly, I went to Home Goods, and I'm walking through, I'm what am I doing here? I guess I'll get some thank you cards. I need those. I go to the thank you card section. There's a lady there. I get in a conversation with her. She starts to share with me that she has severed nerves in her back, and she's been out of work for a year, and she can't even touch her toes, and she's about to have this crazy surgery, and it's going to be this long recovery. And I just said, well, that's not God's will for you. So let's just pray for you and he'll heal you. And I just stepped out and I prayed for her, and the power of God fell, and she was healed right away. And literally, okay, do something you couldn't do. And she starts crying, just wow, I haven't been able to touch my toes, for this long. And so it started to ignite a fire and a hunger inside of me to say, Lord, I just want to give you the glory for everything I do and do more of those things. And so I start pursuing him, and I go to this Azusa Now conference where there's like 120,000 people getting together, praying for the world. And there was just amazing things that happened there. But this guy named Sean Bowles comes out, and he pulls out his cell phone, and he's like, is there a Stan and June Smith here? And it's 120,000 people, right? I'm like, where is he going with this? Like, what is this weirdo doing? Pulls out his cell phone, is there Stan and June Smith here? And someone like 20 feet away from me is like, yeah, that's us. And then he says, does January 2nd mean anything to you? Yeah. He's all, is that your anniversary? Yeah. And like everything he was saying was right. And I'm like, this is staged. Like, let's be honest. Like, how many of you have seen something and you're like, that's not real? Like, nah. Yeah. And so he says, it's Winding Way mean anything to you? And they're like, yeah, that's where we're from. And so then he starts to prophesy over them and say, like God is calling you back to your roots, and you're going to go home and you're going to transform the culture and this and that. And it was just amazing because I still didn't believe it even after that. Just to be honest, but then he did it with like 6 or 7 more people, and everything he said was 100% accurate. And I'm like, what the heck is that? Well, it's called a word of knowledge. Like, he led with the word of knowledge. Jesus shared information with him to share his love with people. And so I started to say, how can I share my love with people? So I came back and I read his book, Translating God, and then I went to a training, and I started pursuing God like I never had before, just spending time with him. And he started speaking to me, and I started to get words for people, and I started to feel things for people. And I don't know, it's really weird. I get things either when I'm in the shower or when I'm like on my way to take a whiz, like I'm on my way, and it's just the weirdest thing. Maybe because you're not thinking, you're just not thinking. And it's true. I'm sorry, number one, when I go number one. But the crazy thing is that I just remember, like, I was at Pete's Coffee with a member of this church, and I just go to the bathroom and I feel like I'm having like a heart attack would be the best way to describe it. Like, I literally could not breathe. I'm like, what is this? Like, I can't. And really, I go back and I'm like, okay, well, this isn't normal. So I go back and I sit down with the guy that I'm having coffee with, and I'm like, hey, this is gonna sound completely crazy, but I'm just working on hearing from God, and I feel like this crazy pressure, stress, like anxiety. It feels like anxiety. Do you have any anxiety right now? And he just looks at me with like the most blank look on his eyes, like how do you know that? And he says, I've been struggling with anxiety for 2 weeks. I've lived a crazy life. I was homeless for a good part of my life, but like I've lived a crazy life, and I've never struggled with anxiety. And so I just said, well, God wants to heal you of that. And so we pray. And as we start praying, the joy of the Lord fell down. And we were both giggling, laughing, like in the middle of Pete's. And people are like, and I didn't care. My eyes were closed. It didn't even matter, right? So I'm praying, and all of a sudden, the anxiety's gone. And he's healed of it. And then I start talking about how he's going to go and change infrastructure and build third world countries and do amazing things for God, that he's called him out of this region and all these other things. And I'm like, that's nothing that I would ever come up with. But like, it's just the amazing joy of the Lord came out. And I tell you that story to say that, like, I haven't gone to seminary. I'm just like you guys. I'm a normal person. And all I did was pursue God and what he wanted for my life. And he started to share things with me, and he wants to do the same exact thing for you. And every single one of you. And then you're probably like, oh, well, like, I'm not like that. I'm an introvert. Well, can you bake cookies for someone? Can you give them a compliment? Can you smile? Right? Can any of you smile? Like, turn to the person next to you and they say, don't smile or your face will crack. Like, and try not to smile. Like, it's the craziest thing. Like, everybody can just focus on God and let him lead you to the opportunities that you have in your life with the people you love, with the people here at church, with your community. Like, everybody plays a part. And the second I took my focus off of the works of just focusing on performance and working and unworthiness and all this crazy cycle, and I just focused on God, he started to transform my life. And I get everywhere I go, he's talking to me. And all I do is I go up to I go up into a place and I say, Lord, like, how do you want to love this person? Like, how do you want to love her? Like, show me how to love them the way that you love them. I want to see through your eyes. And I just sit there and just wait. And I do that every single day, and he shares things for me. And sometimes it's crazy profound, and there's healing and prophecy, and sometimes there's nothing. But all I can do is just love other people and pray for them and love on them. And just the amazing things that happen out of that. I'm just so excited to see this body, because there is a shift. We are called to operate in our authority, and there is a shift happening. And so I just encourage every single one of you to just focus on God and what he has for you. And it, like, every single area of my life has increased exponentially. My marriage, my relationship with my kids, my relationship with God, everything. And he wants that for you. He wants abundance for you in every area of your life. So thank you so much for letting me share, guys.